Before my life was cleaved into, there was the before time. In that life, my body was a reliable machine, a tool I took for granted. I was a project manager for a construction firm, a job that was loud, physical, and real. I spent my days on muddy sites, turning blueprints into tangible structures of steel and glass. My weekends were for the mountains, for the sheer vertical poetry of a rock face. My fingers finding holes in the granite. My body a seamless extension of my will. I was alive, and I measured that life in miles hiked and summits reached. Amelia was the co-architect of that life. We were engaged, our future, a blueprint we were both excited to build. We had a joint savings account we called the Future Fund, a testament to our shared discipline. Every dollar a brick in the foundation of the house we planned to buy, the family we planned to start. Her promise to me, made on a starlit night on one of our camping trips, was in sickness and in health. It was an easy promise to make then, when health was the only reality we knew. The first sign was a betrayal by my own hand. I was climbing, reaching for a simple hold, and my fingers just wouldn't close. They tingled, a strange pens and needles numbness that made them feel like they belonged to someone else. I dismissed it as a pinched nerve, but the betrayals kept coming. A stumble on a perfectly flat sidewalk, a sudden, overwhelming fatigue that felt like I was moving through water, a strange electric buzz that would occasionally run down my spine. The man who had trusted his body implicitly was now living inside a stranger, a machine that was beginning to glitch. The doctor's appointments were a blur of tests and sterile questioning rooms. Then came the day of the diagnosis. I remember the beige walls of the neurologist's office, the way the light from the window seemed unnaturally bright. The doctor spoke in a calm, clinical tone, but his words were bombs that detonated the life I knew. Multiple sclerosis, a chronic progressive disease of the central nervous system. He used words like unpredictable lesions and disability. He was drawing a map of a future I didn't want, a landscape of uncertainty and loss. Amelia was there holding my hand, but her grip felt slack, her presence thin. Her tears seemed more for the future she was losing than the man she was losing it with. I was admitted to the hospital that same day for a 5-day course of high-dose intravenous steroids to fight the massive inflammation in my brain and spine. The hospital was a lonely, terrifying island. The steroids made me feel agitated and hollowed out, a ghost in my own skin. Amelia's visits grew shorter, her excuses more elaborate. The compassion in her eyes was replaced by a kind of panicked calculation. I saw her looking at me at the IV pole, at the unsteady way I walked to the bathroom, and I knew she wasn't seeing the man she loved. She was seeing a burden, a life sentence. On the 4th day, she gave me a kiss that felt like a goodbye. She said she had to go out of town for a work emergency, but that she'd be back to pick me up the next day. She told me she loved me. Her performance was flawless right up until the end. The next day, I was discharged. The nurse helped me into a wheelchair, my legs still shaky, my balance a mess. I called Amelia. The call went straight to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. A cold dread heavier and more sickening than any symptom of my disease began to seep into my bones. I took a taxi home, the city looking alien and threatening through the smudged window. The apartment was too quiet. The air was stale still. And on the kitchen counter, weighted down by her engagement ring, was a note. The words were a monument to cowardice, a confession of a love so shallow it couldn't survive a single drop of bad news. She wrote that she was sorry, but she was too young to be a caregiver. She wrote that she hadn't signed up for a life of hospitals and wheelchairs. She wrote that she needed to live her own life, and she hoped I would understand. It wasn't a breakup, it was an amputation, and she wasn't done. With a shaking hand, I picked up my laptop. I logged into our online banking. I navigated to the Future Fund. The balance was a perfect, brutal zero. She had cleaned it out. Every dollar we had saved, The money for the house, the money for our future, the money I now desperately needed for medical bills. And to adapt my life to this new reality, it was all gone. She hadn't just left me. She had robbed me. She had picked the most vulnerable moment of my life. The day I was literally knocked off my feet by a devastating diagnosis. And she had kicked me. I sat there in the silence of my empty apartment, the diagnosis in my blood, the farewell note on my counter, the empty bank account on my screen, and I understood that my life was over. The blueprint was burned. The foundation was gone. All that was left was the sickness inside me and the rubble of a future that would never be built. The weeks that followed were a descent into a place beyond despair. My world shrank to the four walls of the apartment that was no longer mine. The MS flare-up, amplified by the catastrophic stress, was a brutal storm inside my body. My vision would blur, my legs would buckle, and the fatigue was a lead blanket that smothered me. Simple tasks became Herculean labors. Making a sandwich was a multi-stage project that could end in exhaustion. A flight of stairs became an unconquerable mountain. My physical reality was a prison, and my emotional state was the solitary confinement within it. The phone call started soon after. First from the bank, asking about the unusual withdrawal. Then from my boss, a call that was full of fiend sympathy, but ended with the practical reality that I could no longer do my job. I was a liability on a construction site. I was let go. Then came the eviction notice taped to my door, a formal declaration that I had no place left in the world. I was sick, unemployed, broke, and soon to be homeless. Amelia had vanished completely. Her phone was disconnected, her social media was deleted. She had become a ghost who had taken my life with her. The process of dismantling my old self was methodical and humiliating. I sold my climbing gear, the tools of my former identity, for a fraction of its worth. I sold the furniture we had picked out together, the television, the books. Each item was a memory I had to package and sell to a stranger for rent money. I was selling my past just to survive the present. I eventually moved into a dingy ground floor apartment in the worst part of town. The place smelled of mold and failure. There were bars on the windows. It was all I could afford. The loneliness was a physical presence, a cold, heavy shadow that sat with me day and night. The man who had once stood on mountain peaks feeling infinite now felt like the smallest, most broken thing in the universe. My days were a blur of pain, exhaustion, and the endless mind-numbing bureaucracy of applying for disability benefits. I was a stack of papers, a case number, a diagnosis on a form. I hit the absolute bottom one rainy Tuesday. I had dropped a carton of milk, my numb fingers simply letting go. I tried to clean it up, but my legs gave out and I fell onto the cheap linoleum floor, right into the puddle of milk. And I couldn't get up. My body refused to obey. I lay there soaking in the cold milk, the smell of it filling my nostrils, and I just gave up. The fight was gone. I lay there for what felt like hours, not crying, not even thinking, just existing as a pathetic heap of malfunctioning flesh and bone. This was it. This was the end of the line. She had won. But then something shifted. Lying there on that filthy floor, I thought about her, about the smug pity she would feel if she could see me now. The thought of giving her that satisfaction, the satisfaction of being right about me being a hopeless burden, sparked something. It was a tiny flickering ember of defiance in the cold ashes of my despair. It was rage. And that rage was better than the emptiness. It was fuel. I used every ounce of strength I had, my arms shaking, my muscles screaming, and I dragged myself across the floor to a chair. It took me 20 minutes, but I pulled myself up. I stood there dripping with milk, shaking with exertion and fury, and I made a new promise, not to a woman, but to myself. I would not let her be the author of the end of my story. The next day, I made a phone call. I had found a flyer for a local MS support group in a hospital brochure weeks ago and had shoved it in a drawer, ashamed. Now it was my only hope. I walked into that church basement meeting feeling like a complete failure. I expected a room full of pity and sorrow. Instead, I found life. I found a community of warriors. There was an old woman in a scooter who told wickedly funny jokes. There was a young lawyer who used a cane, but argued cases in court. There was a woman who had run a marathon with a walker. They all had the same unpredictable monster living inside them, but they hadn't surrendered. They talked about medications, about managing symptoms, about fighting insurance companies, but more than that, they talked about living. They shared tips for adaptive technology, for career changes, for finding joy in a life that had been irrevocably altered. For the first time since my diagnosis, I wasn't alone. They didn't see me as a tragic case. They saw me as the new guy. They saw potential. One of them, a man named David, who had been a carpenter before the disease took the strength from his hands, told me about his new career. He had retrained as a web developer. He worked from home on his own schedule, his mind his only necessary tool. A light went on in my head. I had managed multi-million-dollar construction projects. I knew logistics, budgets, and client management. My body was broken, but my mind was still there, albeit a little foggy on bad days. That night, I used the last of my savings to enroll in an online project management certification course, one specializing in the tech industry. It was a gamble, a desperate shot in the dark. But as I clicked enroll, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It was purpose. The fight was on. The next 2 years were a slow, arduous climb out of the abyss. My life was a Spartan routine of study, rest, and support group meetings. The online course was my lifeline, a structured path in a life that had become chaotic and formless. There were days the cog fog, a frustratingly common MS symptom, made it feel like I was trying to think through a thick cloud. My memory would fail. My focus would wander. But I would remember lying on that milk-soaked floor, and the rage would return, sharpening my resolve. I pushed through, rereading chapters, taking copious notes, forcing my tired brain to forge new neural pathways. The support group was my bedrock. They were my mentors, my cheerleaders, my comrades in arms. They understood the invisible battles I was fighting every day. The crushing fatigue that felt like a flu. The random bouts of vertigo. The frustration of a body that was no longer a friend. They taught me how to advocate for myself with doctors, how to navigate the labyrinthine disability system, and most importantly, how to laugh at the sheer absurdity of it all. I finally finished my certification. The digital certificate that popped up on my screen was more meaningful to me than any college diploma. It was a symbol of my first victory in my new life. Armed with this new qualification, I ventured into the world of freelance remote work. My first project was a small, low-paying gig, organizing a timeline for a mobile app developer. It was terrifying. Imposter syndrome was a constant nagging voice in my head. But my years of managing complex construction sites had given me a deep instinctual understanding of logistics. I broke the project down, created a clear workflow, and delivered it ahead of schedule. The client was thrilled. That small success was a crack of light in the darkness. I took on another project, then another. My confidence began to grow, one successfully completed task at a time. I was building a new reputation, not as Ben the rock climber, but as Ben the reliable, detail-oriented remote project manager. I was earning a real income again, enough to move out of the roach-infested apartment and into a small but clean and accessible one-bedroom. The first piece of furniture I bought was a proper ergonomic office chair. It was a throne for my new kingdom. As my professional life started to stabilize, I poured my energy back into the community that had saved me. I started a blog, a brutally honest and sometimes darkly funny account of my daily life with MS. I wrote about the things no one talks about: the indignity of losing bladder control, the secret joy of a handicapped parking spot, the existential dread of waking up and not knowing if your legs will work. The blog struck a nerve. I started getting emails from people all over the world, newly diagnosed and terrified, who said my words made them feel less alone. I had found my voice. I was no longer just a victim of a disease. I was becoming an advocate, a translator for the difficult language of chronic illness. It was through this advocacy work that I met Lena. She was a physical therapist who ran an adaptive exercise program for people with neurological conditions. She invited me to speak to her group. I was immediately struck by her. She had a calm, powerful presence, and she treated her clients not as patients to be fixed, but as athletes training for a different kind of event. There was no pity in her eyes, only a fierce, practical compassion. Our relationship began as a professional collaboration and slowly, cautiously blossomed into something more. She was the first person I truly let in since Amelia. The prospect was terrifying. I was damaged goods, a man with a broken body and a shattered trust. One evening, I knew I had to tell her the whole story. I told her about Amelia, the diagnosis, the note, the stolen money. I laid the ugliest, most painful parts of my life out for her, fully expecting her to run. She listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "The only thing that story tells me is that you know how to survive." She didn't see a victim. She saw a survivor. And in that moment, I knew I could love again. Our life together was built on a foundation of radical honesty. There were no secrets. She learned the rhythms of my illness, knew when to push me and when to let me rest. She celebrated my victories, like landing a major long-term client, and she was there for my defeats, like the days I couldn't get out of bed. She loved me, not in spite of my MS, but with it. It was simply a part of the man she had chosen. We turned my blog into a nonprofit foundation, the MS Collective, an online resource hub for the newly diagnosed. We created guides, hosted forums, and advocated for better disability rights. My life had a purpose I could never have imagined in my before time. I wasn't building skyscrapers anymore. I was building a community, a lifeline for people who were lost in the same darkness I had once been. The money Amelia had stolen, the Future Fund, had been meant for a house and a family. It was a bitter irony that its theft had led me to a different kind of home, a different kind of family, one that was larger, more compassionate, and infinitely more real than the one I had planned. The years were kind. They were not easy, but they were kind. My life with Lena settled into a rhythm of shared purpose and deep, quiet love. We got married on a sunny afternoon in our small apartment, surrounded by the core members of our support group, the family we had chosen. Our vows were not about sickness and health. They were about honesty, partnership, and the promise to always see the warrior in each other. The MS Collective grew into a significant force in the patient advocacy world. What started as a personal blog became a registered charity with a small staff, all working remotely. We launched mentorship programs pairing the newly diagnosed with veterans like me. We raised money for accessibility grants, helping people afford the home modifications and equipment that insurance wouldn't cover. I was no longer just a freelance project manager. I was the executive director of a nonprofit that was making a tangible difference in thousands of lives. My MS was a constant companion. There were still bad days, weeks, even months, where the fatigue was a crushing weight and the pain was a sharp, unwelcome guest. But now, those times were not a descent into lonely despair. I had Lena. I had my community. The disease was a part of my life, but it was not the center of it. The center was the love and the purpose I had found in the wreckage of my old world. I rarely thought about Amelia. She was a ghost from a past that felt increasingly like it had happened to someone else. The sharp edges of the betrayal had been worn smooth by time and by the construction of a new, better life. The anger had been transmuted into the fuel that built my foundation. She was a closed chapter, a historical footnote in my own story. Then, after nearly a decade of silence, the ghost decided to reappear. The email came to the general contact address for the MS Collective. The name in the from field was one I hadn't seen in years: Amelia Rose. My heart did a slow, cold lurch. I clicked it open my hand suddenly unsteady on a mouse. The email was a masterpiece of self-serving revisionist history. She wrote that she had been following my work with the foundation from afar, and that she was so proud of the man I had become. She talked about the time after she left as a period of confusion and fear. She painted herself as a young, terrified girl who had made a terrible mistake. There was no mention of the stolen money. Of course, that was a detail she had conveniently edited out of her narrative. And then came the reason for the email. Her life, she wrote, had not been easy. A failed marriage, a series of bad investments, and now a health crisis of her own. She didn't specify the illness, but she described it in vague, dramatic terms. She said that facing her own mortality had made her realize the gravity of her mistake all those years ago. She wanted to see me. She wanted to apologize, to make things right. She ended the email with a line that was so audacious it almost made me laugh. I know it's a lot to ask, but I feel like our journeys are connected and maybe we can help each other heal. I felt a familiar cold rage rising in me. The same rage that had helped me pull myself off that milk-soaked floor. Help her heal after she had left me to die, emotionally and financially. The sheer staggering narcissism was breathtaking. I showed the email to Lena. She read it and her calm, compassionate face hardened into a mask of protective fury. "You owe her nothing," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You don't even owe her a response." I knew she was right, but a part of me needed to do this. I needed to see her, not for her, but for me. I needed to stand in front of the person who had tried to destroy me. Not as the broken, terrified victim she had abandoned, but as the man I was now, whole and strong, and let her see what she had thrown away. I agreed to meet her at a neutral public coffee shop. When I saw her, I barely recognized her. The vibrant, beautiful woman from my memory was gone, replaced by a thin, anxious-looking woman with tired eyes and a life's worth of disappointment etched into her face. She launched into a tearful, rehearsed monologue about her fears, her regrets, her hardships. It was a performance, and she was the star of her own tragedy. I listened patiently without interruption. When she finally wound down, dabbing at her dry eyes, she looked at me expectantly, waiting for my absolution. I took a slow sip of my coffee. "You've misunderstood something, Amelia," I said, my voice steady and calm. "You didn't leave because I got sick. You left because you are a coward. You left because your love was conditional and the conditions were breached." Her face palled. "You didn't just leave," I continued. "You robbed a sick man. You took the money meant to keep a roof over his head and pay for his treatment, and you used it to fund your escape from a difficult situation. That isn't a mistake. That is an act of profound, unforgivable cruelty." I leaned forward slightly. "You want me to help you heal? You want closure? I can't give you that. My life is not about you anymore. The best thing that ever happened to me was the day you walked out that door. Your betrayal forced me to find a strength I never knew I had. Your cruelty led me to a community of the strongest people I've ever met. Your absence made room for a woman whose love is real and deep and unconditional. You didn't come here to help me heal. You came here because your life is a wreck, and you thought you could find some comfort in rewriting the past, but you don't get to do that." I stood up, placing a $10 bill on the table to cover our coffees. "My life is full. My life is happy. And it is happy precisely because you are not in it. That's all the closure you're ever going to get." I walked out of that coffee shop and didn't look back. I got in my car and drove home to my wife, to my life's work, to the home I had built not on a foundation of stolen money, but on the bedrock of my own survival. The chapter was finally completely closed.